Welcome to The Nation. I'm Jessie CHAHAL. Malaysia and the United States share a long-standing dynamic trade relationship with the US among our top export destinations. But as global supply chains evolve and economic uncertainties grow, the question is, how can both countries strengthen ties and unlock new areas of growth? Well, joining me today to unpack the challenges, strategies and opportunities is Mark MEALY, Executive Vice President and Chief Officer at the US-ASEAN Business Council. Mark, welcome to the show and thanks for being with us here. You've been in Malaysia and in ASEAN for quite a while. Certainly, you know the ins and outs of trade and investment as well. But more importantly, the challenges facing American trade and investment in the country and Southeast Asia as well. Businesses are now looking for a sense of certainty, especially after the recent announcement, which is affecting 168 countries, including some of the highest imposed within the ASEAN bloc. We're looking at Vietnam as one of those countries as well. Currently, we're in the midst of that 90-day pause, and now we have the US federal court ruling that the tariffs are in fact illegal. That obviously adds to a bit of that uncertainty around the issue. What can businesses, Mark, expect after all of this? Do they stand to lose, especially those who are already exporting to the US? And will this lead to a steep decline in Malaysian exports to the US?
Yeah, it is a very challenging time for companies that are global and or local, but do business in ASEAN and Malaysia, manufacture here, but then export to the rest of the world, including the US. I think one thing that everyone has to realize that as the America First trade policy is implemented, and we've seen there be implementation of these tariffs initially, the administration's approach is that regardless of the outcomes of the government-to-government negotiations, we are going to see higher US import taxes on Americans who purchase goods made outside of America. Now, whether that might be a tax of 10%, which would be at the low end, or potentially higher up to the reciprocal tariff levels, which have been proposed, that, as you said, Cambodia being the highest at 47%, I believe. Once the negotiations are concluded, we do expect those high-end ranges to be brought downward, particularly where there's a successful negotiation. But it is a new reality that for American or foreign producers here who are exporting to America, their customers are going to have to, in a sense, pay higher taxes when they purchase those goods from outside of America.
Based on that, what has been some of the feedback you've seen or heard since the announcement on the tariffs?
So I think for American companies that are here in Malaysia, for example, that manufacture here but export all over the world and back to the United States, it does represent some challenges because obviously it means inputs that maybe they utilize in operations back in the United States. The cost of those inputs may go up because they have to pay a tax to the US government when they bring those products in. I think for Malaysia's situation is a little bit different in the sense that while Malaysia is a big exporter to the world and some of their exports do go to the United States, the majority of Malaysia's exports, though, are really to other markets around the world, relative to, say, like a Vietnam or to other countries. So because Malaysia values the really important US-Malaysia relationship, this does mean we want to try, I think the government does want to try to work with the US government, find win-win kinds of scenarios. But at the same time, there's, I think, a sense of we want to be careful in how we negotiate these conversations. And also there's other things we think the government of Malaysia and governments in the region will do to maybe even try to offset the potential maybe negative impacts of the sort of change in US trade policy.
Right, so based on that, to really tread with care, what are you doing at this point to take in the concerns of those who are a little bit worried around the edges about, what can happen in the next few months in terms of business and investment?
Yeah, so we're working on really several kinds of areas. Number one, we are engaging with all the governments in Southeast Asia, including the government of Malaysia, to really try to identify commercial trade opportunities. So are there ways that maybe Malaysian importers can buy more American products? So that's the first thing. Secondly, we are talking to the government of Malaysia and helping them to identify, are there certain policies, rules, or regulations that perhaps are hindering further expansion for American companies to do more work here in Malaysia, because we think if we can identify, let's say, the most impactful potential reforms, that if the governor of Malaysia were to agree to make some of those changes, then boom, we expand commercial activity. So that's part of the job. Secondly, we are, of course, talking to the U.S. government, and we're trying to ensure a couple of things. Number one, the value of this overall relationship. Many folks, I think, don't realize that the US-ASEAN economic relationship is over a $400 billion trade relationship. There are roughly 26 states that have annual exports of goods to countries here in Malaysia and the neighboring region of over $1 billion per year, which supports a lot of jobs back in America. So our first job is, how do we make sure people understand the value of this? It's a mutually beneficial relationship, and we don't want to see, as the negotiations happen, we don't want to see those relationships sort of disrupted or weakened going forward. Second thing I think we're trying to encourage the administration is to really appreciate the U.S. private sector has really signaled to the entire world that this is the part of the world in Asia where they see more of their future growth and more of their future opportunities.
Right, so based on that, what would be the USP for US to look towards ASEAN?
For the U.S. government or business?
For businesses and of course for the U.S. government.
So for the U.S. business community, the investments that we're seeing that have been coming into both Malaysia and other countries, particularly in areas like technology, as we know, like down in the Johor corridor, where you're seeing basically Johor has become the global hotspot for investment in ICT infrastructure. A lot of Americans are part of that story. In things like medical devices and pharmaceutical products, we're now seeing over a number of years, U.S. companies have said, you know what, Malaysia and Southeast Asia is a great place to locate operations to then provide those products all over the world. So I think the U.S. private sector is very, very clear that this part of the world really matters.
You were in the U.S. in April, and there was a meeting with Malaysia's, of course, of officials as well. You touched on the strategic importance of the global semiconductor industry, and you even went to the extent to praise Malaysia's successful rollout of some of these reforms. As we know, Malaysia has launched the NSS, and that is, of course, in part of its quest to emerge as a global leader in this sector. Also, you know, there is this, of course, way forward in terms of looking at more investments here in the country. Where are we on this, and has the US sort of shown more increased interest in investments within Malaysian operations?
Yeah, as I mentioned, like there's areas where in the sort of the technology stack area where Malaysia is well positioned. It's recognized as a global leader in a number of segments and sort of ICT supply chains. Now we're at a point where a bit of an inflection point, because some of the areas where Malaysia has been super successful over decades are now facing greater sort of competitive pressures. And I think the government's response, which is basically say, just because we've been successful, let's say in the assembly, testing, and packaging area for semiconductor chips for many years, now we have to sort of move up the value chain. Why? Number one, there is a sense, particularly on the US side, that there's too much of a concentration of the sort of the global locations for that kind of activity, and there's a desire to sort of to further diversify that, which again, Malaysia is strong in that space, and more diversification potentially maybe brings other competitors into the same space. So one way to respond to increased competition, of course, is move to higher value, higher skilled technology areas.
This high value, high skill, then equal high cost, and what would be some of the ways around that?
Well, they equal high cost, but they also generate greater revenues in a sense. So there's things like, you know, working on, let's say, R&D design for chips, or investing in some of the new technologies around packaging. Things, again, Malaysia is well known in those areas for decades, but now the pressure is, how can Malaysia and the factories that are here, the companies that are here, how can they look at where can we sort of upskill our talent, our machinery, and move into areas that maybe historically we haven't always been, but now because of competitive pressures, the US-China relationship, now Malaysia has to move upward in order to stay active in this space.
And is there some efforts towards helping this movement?
Yeah, definitely. I think industry, which has been here for so many decades, they want those investments that have been very profitable to continue to be profitable in the future. So they also realize there's a role to play for American investors to help industry and the ecosystem here to continue to evolve, to get better, so that again, higher value products in the ICT space can be produced here in Malaysia, and that again will sustain sort of the growth trajectory of that industry here in Malaysia. Because you can't look backwards. You know, Malaysia has been great again in testing of chips for 30 years. That may not be something that Malaysia wants to be focused on for the next 30 years. Maybe it's chip design. Maybe it's in other new emerging areas that we're seeing innovation happening. That's more the future, and that's where the reforms that the government has sort of launched, some of the investments they're making, and the role of the existing private sector. That's how they've got to move Malaysia forward now, because now, in a sense, Malaysia doesn't have a choice. They've got to move upward.
What would you say, zooming out, are some of the, what we call the low-hanging fruit? Where are the opportunities really to get this moving in terms of the short term?
Yeah, I think the fact that, you know, AI has become such a new key component of sort of the technology space, and that sort of the infrastructure necessary to really, for then businesses across many sectors to start using this technology requires the infrastructure, requires the data centers, the cloud hubs, the undersea cables. The fact that Malaysia is now positioned as one of the sort of the globally competitive nodes in that infrastructure bodes well for the fact that as that industry begins to mature and those new data centers and new factories become online, that actually will lower cost for these new types of technology services, AI services, which hopefully will make it easier for all kinds of businesses to access those new technologies, to begin to digitize their products, their services, and have a bigger multiplier effect. So I think right now that infrastructure play is at a foundational level. And then obviously, again, talent will be key, regulations will be key in terms of how we continue to evolve the local environment to tap into some of these new technology innovations. But Malaysia's got the great foundation, but they've got to go up.
Right, we've got to go upwards. You say that we've got a great foundation and that we're in a good place. But with the US, you know, the recent 24% announcement as well for Malaysia, does this put us in a tough position as we have to pay the price as a small economy?
Well, I think what it does is that we have to understand the reciprocal tariffs. You referenced the proposed 24% tax that an American would have to pay if they bought a shirt made in Malaysia, a palm oil product made in Malaysia. That doesn't actually apply to some of these technology areas just yet. Actually, one of the things that we're beginning to now focus on looking forward is, once this reciprocal tariff negotiation process is concluded, the reality is the administration is also planning to implement other types of tariffs in the future. And
what would that be?
So basically, under US law, for example, there are provisions that an administration can implement under the guise of, you know, protecting, let's say, economic security or national security kinds of concerns. And this is where the intersection for Malaysia comes into place, because as you said, Malaysia is a global player in the semiconductor space. Some of the future potential tariffs probably will be applied to products in the semiconductor space, which could then therefore have an impact for Malaysia. So what's going to happen, I think, going forward is the government of Malaysia, which understands that, will begin to have sort of another negotiation specifically looking at tariffs or maybe being excluded from such tariffs on those particular products in the future. It's probably a conversation that when the next time Minister Zafrul comes to the United States, that'll probably be some of the things
on the table.
Exactly, to begin to have that discussion. The other big one to keep an eye on for Malaysia is also pharmaceutical medical device products. This is, again, another important industry for Malaysia. Part of the products are exported to the United States. We expect in the future there may also become, we call them 232 sectoral tariffs, may be applied to that industry as well. Therefore, I would expect the government of Malaysia also to say, we need to maybe have a negotiation on those industry products as well, because that would also be very relevant for Malaysia going forward.
There will be a lot of back and forth in terms of getting the best deal possible. We take a quick breather right here on The Nation. We'll be right back with Mo. Don't go anywhere.
Ada kala kegembiraan kita mampu lenyap dalam sekelip mata akibat persepsi kita.
Dia ingat aku singkit sangat ke?
Usah fikir dengan mata, usah rasa dengan hati.
Dia ingat aku nak curi beg dia ke?
Fikir secara positif, rasa dengan rasional. Kerana apa yang kita fikir
Dia ingat saya bagi duit palsu kah?
dan apa yang kita rasa tak semestinya benar.
Baju cantik lah. Beli mana?
Baju ni ke? Saya beli kat sebelah je.
Oh,
Rajinnya awak. Pagi tadi jual potong ayam. Sekarang hantar orang pula.
Tak ada lah kak. Ini lebih lah kak. Ni Baki. Lain kali pakai QR je.
terima kasih.
Kerana seperti saya, persepsi itu sebenarnya tidak nyata. Kita mampu mengubahnya secara positif dan rasional untuk hidup yang lebih bahagia.
Welcome back to The Nation. We're looking at the importance of adapting to global shifts and to deepen cooperation between the US and Malaysia. Mark, we talk about trade and investment, of course, business as well. And one thing that is important in this entire sort of area or picture is supply chains. There's of course concern that there could be some disruption to supply chains that could lead to increased costs to the US, and of course that could help or not help but could hinder in terms of the progress in business. We are receiving reports at this point that there are ports, especially in like LA, that are seeing some substantial decline in its volume. How can we as a trading partner work together to ensure that we really see some shift in helping to mitigate the risk?
Yeah, the supply chain question for business is really one of the more fundamental ones because governments can have policy goals and put in place regulations, tariffs, et cetera, to try to achieve certain things that they want. But oftentimes those efforts, if they don't fully take into account the extent of supply chains that as they currently exist, you can end up with commercial disruptions. And as you indicated, we've already seen in certain markets examples of that where fewer products have literally come into a given country, finished products, and if you worked your way backwards, it's because there was some kind of disruption on a part of the supply chain going forward. So I think for governments around the world, whether it be Malaysia, the US government, there's a greater focus on how do we promote more supply chain resilience to make sure that our factories in our country are able to source the inputs they need at good prices, make the products they want to make, and then export them or support the domestic market. One of the things that we've certainly seen is that governments in Southeast Asia, increasingly like Malaysia, are increasingly looking at joining additional free trade agreements as one approach to both diversify supply chains, which then can add more resilience to supply chains, helping keep goods flowing and also at good prices, so that factories which have to manufacture things don't have to automatically raise the prices of the items which they make.
We spoke about this briefly earlier, Mark, in terms of from the US looking into ASEAN. What strikes you as something truly interesting or truly remarkable or unique about the ASEAN landscape and the future of how the US and ASEAN can work together?
Sure. I think one of the first things that always jumps out to me when I talk to people in America about this relationship, most Americans don't realize that if you look at the list of America's top 20 trade partners in the world today, 4 of them are ASEAN countries, which include Malaysia. People are shocked when I say that right now America's 8th largest trade partner in the world is Vietnam, a country that we were once at war with, so to speak. And that's only been it hasn't been a lifetime of that kind of change. Second thing I would say, in this part of the world is also being recognized more as a place where you can find world-class innovation. And I think that's also something which is becoming increasingly valuable for multinational companies. When they're looking around the world to say, sure, we want to find a place where we can do business, cost of business is adequate, good rules, good laws, those kinds of things. But they're also now saying, where are examples of innovation happening? And I think countries like in Malaysia and ASEAN are now slowly being recognized more so as a place where innovation is taking place.
What does this signal or signify about the change in the interest in ASEAN? You mentioned that with Vietnam, the US once was at war. Of course, we know that, but it has come this far to this point. What is this signaling about the future of business and a very flat sort of outlook towards how business can be done?
Yeah, I think there's right now thoughts that, you know, the era of globalization has come to an end. Are we moving to an environment where there are blocks, where if you're a global firm, you have to have a American strategy, a China strategy, and then maybe a global strategy, right? I think what's key for ASEAN is that ASEAN needs to position itself as always a place that is globally competitive. So in other words, regardless of what strategy you're navigating, if you're a global firm, you should think that if I want to make sure I have my global strategy, ASEAN has a big role to play in that. And I think that's really why when we see ASEAN moving forward, for example, as a group of nations with, for example, upgrading the ASEAN TIGA, the Trade in Goods Agreement, when we see ASEAN as a group of nations agreeing on upgrading the ASEAN-China FTA agreement, when we see ASEAN currently negotiating a free trade agreement with Canada, for example. These are the kinds of things that regardless of what's happening with US and US-China and other kinds of things, as long as ASEAN is doing those kinds of things, global companies will continue to say, this is a part of the world that we need to be in.
So does that mean then when you say, well, in other words, all eyes can be on ASEAN at this point, it has so much to offer, do you feel that some of the countries within ASEAN need to diversify? Or you mentioned earlier, make the value higher jump up that value. Is there a need for that?
Yeah, I think if you're trying to stay globally competitive and continue to attract the interests of global firms, you always have to keep engaging with the firms to say, what more do I need to do to improve my business? So the first thing I would say is right now is a great time for countries in Southeast, including Malaysia, to really take a look at some of their own domestic regulations and policies and really try to understand, are these the best regulations we can have for the companies that we want to attract here? That's the first thing.
But I get that, Mark, but is it easier said than done? I mean, what's your take on this?
It can be, John, because let's be honest, some of the policies, rules, and regs in any given country are also political. Just like in America, we have politically sensitive rules and regs as well. So we understand, as from a business point of view, that not every rule or regulation that might be perfect for business also can be okay politically for a country. So that's the balance that we want to try to strike in the countries where we work in here in Southeast Asia.
With all the effort back and forth as well, Mark, are there any plans, indulges for a US trade and investment trip here to Malaysia anytime soon, a mission?
Yeah, we actually recently had a mission to Malaysia just in the last 2 weeks. We brought over 25 companies to Malaysia. Again, these are companies that some are already here, but some are now taking a fresh look at Malaysia given kind of the uncertainty that's going on in the world. I think the fact that Malaysia is ASEAN chair also provides a great platform because many of the ASEAN summits and the regional ministerial meetings are all held in Malaysia this year. And US-ASEAN Business Club, we bring delegations of American companies to attend these very regional events. That means Malaysia has more opportunities to showcase these are the things that we have to offer to global companies and particularly to American firms. Here's the policy directions that we're taking. And again, in this current environment, that's what global firms are really looking for. They're looking for more certainty and understanding where you're trying to go. And if that makes sense for us, how can we be part of that story? Absolutely,
much to look forward to between ASEAN and the US. Thanks, Mark, for coming in and sharing those insights. Well, of course, today's conversation not only highlights the importance and the need to adapt to global shifts, but also how we can deepen cooperation between the US and Malaysia to overcome trade challenges, to unlock new economic opportunities for both sides. Well, this has been this edition of The Nation. Make sure you keep it locked on to Purnama TV for more updates and conversations that matter. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.